Welcome to this new section of the course. In this section, we're going to cover a lot of the more advanced options and settings you have with really any Canon DSLR. In the next few lessons, we actually go pretty advanced, talking about the main settings you have to control your exposure, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. We cover how you manually adjust those things with your camera, and we're really just jumping right into some manual options, which can get a little advanced. So if those things are a little bit too scary for you right now, or if you start watching those videos and realize they are too advanced for where you're at right now as a photographer, go ahead and skip them. Jump down to the lesson on focusing after the exposure triangle, which is probably the next lesson I would recommend, which is a very important skill to have as a photographer, which covers how you can adjust what you're focusing on, both manually and automatically. But I did just want to include this as a little warning in case things do get a little bit too advanced too quickly. I do try to break those concepts down in the next lessons for beginners, but some people might not even want to use the manual settings on their camera, and that's completely fine. So if you want to continue with those lessons, we'll see you in the next one. Otherwise, we'll see you in the future lesson on focusing. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to read and adjust exposure with your camera. I'm going to go over some of the basics, like what exposure is, what aperture, ISO, and shutter speed are, and how they control exposure. But if you are completely new to photography and you want a more in-depth course on how cameras actually work and all kinds of things, I definitely recommend checking out the Photography Masterclass as well, which is a great companion class with this course. This course, to be honest, is supposed to be a how-to guide to using your camera, and you should already know some of those basics, but of course, I want to go over them in this class, but if I go over them a little bit too quickly, that's because we have the other Photography Masterclass, which goes over them in more depth, in a better way, with more visuals and things like that, I think you should check out. So anyways, before we get started, there's a couple things I want you to do if you are using a Canon T7i or a newer Canon DSLR, because the menus and the displays are set up a little bit differently than a traditional Canon DSLR. So first, I'm going to turn it on like so. I also have my mode in manual mode, which will give us more options and really see how we can use our manual settings. We'll go over some of these other options in future lessons. Now, if I look at my back screen, you'll notice that it might look a little different than yours. It's a very basic, what they call guided way. I'm going to actually change that to the traditional Canon menu. So if I press the menu button in the top left, and if you go to the very far right, so this one, which says display level settings, I'm going to press OK to go into that menu, and you'll see that the shooting screen and the menu display are on guided mode. I'm going to change that to the standard mode. So go in there, press set, go down to standard, and then same with menu display, go in there, set it to standard. And that will change the way that it looks like on the back of your screen. And this is most likely what you are going to see if you are using any Canon DSLR. Now, if I press the shutter button just a little bit, it actually kind of engages the camera, and you can see our settings at the top. We have the M for manual mode. We have 1/60th, which is a fraction, which is our shutter speed. We have f5.6, which refers to the aperture, and then the ISO is auto. And these are the main exposure options we have, the way that we can adjust our camera settings to expose properly. So remember, exposure is how bright or dark your image is. And we have those three options within the camera to make those adjustments. So going through them, let's go and start with shutter speed. So pressing the info button or the shutter button, halfway we can see if I adjust the dial at the top, this one right here, that's automatically going to be adjusting our shutter speed. So if I go all the way to the left, you can see that it actually starts to show as 10, and then it's got like the quotation, which is seconds. So this would be a 6-second shutter, 5-second, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then we get into the fractions. And that's actually how long the shutter is open, letting in light into the camera. So the way a DSLR works is you press the shutter release button, the mirror that's in your camera flips up. The mirror is what actually allows you to see what you're looking at through your viewfinder. The mirror flips up. The light actually hits the sensor, the digital sensor of your camera, which is inside behind the mirror. And depending on your shutter speed, it's letting that light hit it for a certain amount of time. So for example, it's gonna let it hit for 1/125th of a second, which is very, very short. But depending on how much light is, that might be as fast or as slow as you need it to expose properly. Now on this camera, I can go as fast as 1/4000th of a second. So that's really, really quick. So if I take a photo like that, it's going to be pretty dark. You can barely see what I saw. Now, while I'm scrolling through this dial, I noticed that my ISO is also changing, and that's because it's on auto. I wanna change my ISO to a manual mode. So on the top of my grip, there's this ISO button. I'm going to press that. Then I'm just going to change it from ISO auto to, let's just start with 200. Generally, the lower the ISO, the better. All right, there's one other thing I want you to look at as we're going through these settings. That's this exposure meter down here. See where it says -3 and then it has this scale up to +3? This is our exposure meter. Now, if I press the shutter button halfway down and then I scroll through my settings, you can see a little dot at the bottom of this meter. Now, what that is saying is how bright or dark our image is going to be, so that before you even take a photo, you have a sense of how exposed it's going to be. If it's to the right of the 0, if it's a positive number, then it means it's going to be really bright. And if it's past 3, you can see that it changes to a little triangle pointing to the right, which just kind of tells you, okay, it's way, way overexposed. So you know, okay, we need to make it darker. Now, understanding a little bit about how the shutter speed works, what do you think? If a shutter is longer, do you think it's going to be brighter or darker? It's gonna be brighter because you're letting in more light. So if it's too bright, we need to have a faster shutter speed to make it darker, right? So let's press the shutter release button halfway again. We are going to make it around 1/30th of a second, so it's right in the middle. So let me take a picture like that. You get a quick display of what it looked like, and that was well exposed. Now, if I take one where it's at -3, it's going to be dark, right? Now, if I take it at +3, it's going to be bright. The one other thing you want to be aware of is that if your shutter speed is too slow, it literally is actually capturing light for a long period of time. So if you have any sort of shake of the camera or little tiny motion, your image is going to end up looking blurry because it's capturing a photo while your hand is actually moving. So you have to be aware of that. So that's shutter speed and the basics of how you can read your exposure before you take a photo with the exposure meter. Now notice though, on this camera, you only can see that little preview dot of where it's exposed after I press the shutter release button halfway down. Another cool trick for using that half press is to focus your camera. So if you are in an autofocus mode, and I want to focus on, let's go actually to our live preview. So let's go open like this. If I want to check my focus before I take a photo, I can actually half press that button down, and now I'm focused on the screwdriver. This camera does a pretty good job at choosing what is the subject to focus on. Now if I move it up, focus on the background, and I press the shutter halfway and go back to the screwdriver, you can see that it's out of focus. So half pressing allows us to focus it and also preview where we are at on the exposure dial, which you can see here on the bottom of the screen as well. It's a little bit harder on this view to see it in that camera, but you also get a live preview of how dark or bright your image is. So this is a good way to kind of see -3, very dark, +3, very bright. Generally, you want to stay right in between -1 and +1. Of course, you can get creative with this, and there's no real rules in photography that you aren't allowed to break when you're trying to be creative. So sometimes you might want your photo to be overexposed or underexposed. All right, we covered a lot in this lesson, but hopefully now you know how to use this dial to adjust your shutter speed and also how to read the exposure dial so you know if your photo is exposed or not. In the next couple of lessons, we'll look at those other manual options, aperture and ISO, to see how those affect our exposure as well and how we change them on your camera.